I know that Gary was commenting a little bit about this, and so was John, and we talked also a little bit about this ourselves, and there's been quite a few emails going back and forth as to how do we even talk about these things in a way that is more productive and less confusing. And there were questions I think you guys wanted to talk about the coreness or the core ranking algorithm and that sort of stuff. And then again, we went a little bit back and forth with Gary on what are we even talking about here. And I guess, so there's two things. First of all, there's a metaphor that is not mine, but I will borrow it happily from Gary, about cars. And at first I didn't understand it, but bear with me. The parts of the engine apparently were not always part of the engine. And the example he gave me was the starter. It used to be a big external stick that you plugged into the front of the car and then you twisted it. And now younger viewers will have no idea what I'm talking about, but believe me, watch some older movies. But then eventually, spark plugs, everything, it just came and became part of the engine and is now under the hood and nobody even knows how it works. So if you want to think about what's core and what's not core for us, the analogy would be something like this. It's less about the functionality of the thing, which probably doesn't change that much over time. It's more about how we perceive it in the context of the algorithm itself. As in, do we still think, oh, this is an experimental thing that's been running for a while and we're still not sure how long it's going to last? Or is it, yeah, obviously, it's like PageRank. It's at the heart of it. It's always going to be there, at least in the foreseeable future. And therefore, we might call it, in certain contexts, core part of the algorithm. As for the updates, back to your original question. And I think this has been going on in an interesting circle between Hangouts that we do and then conferences that Gary does and then Hangouts that John does and then questions get asked, answered, and then they get re-asked with a slightly different answer. I'll take a stab at a canonical one and then see if we still have to modify that again. But that's the way I see it. So, and you will understand, and obviously I hope most of our users will be very comfortable with this description as well. We have, on the one hand, the big launches. So somebody sits down, a team of engineers sits down, writes up a whole bunch of code, runs some tests, sees how that affects a sample of results, how they compare to each other. Are they better? Are they worse? They get some stats back on that. Then they go to the launch committee and say, look, I mean, if we do this thing, our results will be so much better. This is the percentage change, this is the happy users and all that stuff. The launch committee goes, okay, fair enough. What are the losses? What are the gains? Sounds good, let's launch this. And that would be something like what Penguin was, what Panda was. Somebody sat down, wrote this huge chunk of code that was going to make a huge difference. That code, right, and that's a big change, that's a big launch. That's something we could talk about. That code is not necessarily static after that. It might not change for years. No one might touch it for a really long time. Or on the contrary, it might be something that engineers will keep submitting change lists for every week to be tweaking little things. How do you treat that? If somebody goes in and tweaks one line of code among thousands of lines of code, is that an update? Is that a launch? What is that? It does go through approvals. There are people who look at each other's change lists. There's a quality check procedure in place. How do we qualify that? If somebody tweaks that little thing, is that Penguin been updated every day? Or do we wait until 5 lines of code have been changed, or 55, or 500? So that makes it more difficult to talk about it in those terms, because small incremental changes like that may or may not happen to different elements of the code simultaneously, separately, as you well know. And you can imagine any machine system would be exactly the same. And then the third part of it is the data collected by these algorithms and processed by them. Primarily the URLs, the websites, and maybe some additional meta information around that. Our primary way of acquiring information about the web is crawling, right? So there's crawler bots out there, Google bots that fetch, render, help index. There are systems which use that. There are systems which might go and look for something themselves. There are systems that would go and talk to the results of what we fetch continuously. There are those that would do it less regularly. And the same system might do it at different intervals, depending on different conditions. What this means, for example, is that imagine we have a bunch of URLs affected by Penguin. So it's a list. Parts of that list will not change for a very long time. Parts of that list might change much more often. Parts of them will change because we crawled those URLs again. Parts of them will change because Penguin decided that it's time to see if this is still relevant or something else has changed that triggered the need to revisit a page.